So good afternoon and welcome to 2 Centuries of Jacksonville, Abandoned African-American Cemeteries. This conversation is the first of 6 planned for 2022, and it is a production of the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund and the Jaxson magazine, launched by Modern Cities in association with WJCT Public Broadcasting. The Jaxson is a multimedia project dedicated to urbanism and culture on Florida's First Coast. My name is Ennis Davis, and I'm a senior planner with Benish & Company, a public historian, vice president of membership and outreach for the Florida chapter of the American Planning Association, and a trustee for the Florida Trust Historic Preservation, and co-founder of online media publications, the JacksonMagazine.com, as well as ModernCities.com. I'll be a moderator for today's panel discussion. So before we dive into today's discussion on African-American cemeteries, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Number 1, please introduce yourselves in the chat box. Number 2, this conversation will be recorded and will be able to be shared early next week. Number 3, if you have any technical difficulties, Lily Weinstein from the DuPont Fund is available for tech support. So please use the chat box to ask for any troubleshooting help. And then last, we will also have some time reserved for Q&A after our panelists share their expertise. So please use the chat box as well to continue to add any questions to the conversation that you want us to answer during the next hour and a half. So today we're honored to have 2 great guests, 2 people I respect very highly, to join us for this important topic. Adrienne Burke, who is the principal planner with Miami-Dade County, and Sarah Miller, who's the director of the Florida Public Archaeology Network, or FPAN's Northeast Florida region. So at this time, I'd like to have both panelists take a little time to personally introduce themselves and share a little bit about their background. And I'll start with you, Adrienne.
Okay, I was going to say, you go, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne Burke. I'm a principal planner with Miami-Dade County. I work in our Office of Long Range Planning and also our Office of Historic Preservation. You may be curious why I'm joining you in Jacksonville from Miami. Previous to being in this position, I actually worked in Northeast Florida for 12 years at the city of Fernandina Beach and Nassau County, and also Riverside Avondale Preservation. So I'm glad to be here with you today about a very important topic and one that I'm very passionate about. So I'm really glad to be here with you all.
Great, and I'm Sarah Miller. I am director of the Northeast and East Central regions for the Florida Public Archaeology Network. And look, I have some nice reminder because I'm in my office today. So, but FPAN is passionate about historic cemeteries. I got involved with them working in Kentucky and having to do too much cemetery removal and thinking, what can we do to keep these places preserved and in place? So I'm Zooming to you today from Flagler College campus, and just really grateful for the opportunity to speak more on this important topic, and with Adrienne and Ennis, who are very knowledgeable, especially about Northeast Florida and Jacksonville. So thank you.
So thank you to both of you. I'm going to go ahead and just jump straight into things by sharing my screen here. And I have a brief presentation to get things started. So here we go. So in Jacksonville, Florida's oldest major city, remains of those who were once enslaved and those who helped rebuild the city following the Great Fire in 1901, lie in abandoned places, under segregation-era parks, industrial sites, and housing developments. With this in mind, I want to spend a few brief moments giving you a brief historical narrative of the topic of abandoned African-American cemeteries in Jacksonville, as well as, in honor of Women's History Month, highlight the lives of a few individuals who rest in them today. To start this brief presentation, I'd like to personalize this topic a bit by paying homage to my ancestors who paved the path for me, Without their sacrifices, I would not be in this position with this opportunity to share history with you today. I also want to publicly thank one of my panelists today, Adrienne Burke, for her influence on me in allowing me or giving me the opportunity to explore my own family history and integrate public history and urban transportation and planning together. So back in 2017, while we were both involved with the Florida Trust, she purchased this book, Remembering Paradise Park, at a board meeting. Being the nosy guy that I am, I asked to flip through it, quickly realizing that the family who operated the Paradise Park had the same last name as my mother's maiden name. I took a cell phone shot and quickly sent it to my mom and asked if she knew anything about this family or this place. Not only did she know the place, she knew the family because they were our cousins. This was also a place where she started dating my dad at a school field trip. So immediately, Remembering Paradise Park became more than just a book to me. It became the start of an ongoing journey to explore and dig into my own past and understand my own family history, which I had never known. It was a journey that has led to visits to several active and abandoned family-related cemeteries and former plantations where my ancestors were enslaved in Florida and South Carolina. I've grown tremendously since coming across Remembering Paradise Park at that Florida Trust board meeting. So although I know that, Adrienne, I know you weren't expecting this, thank you. And also thank you for never asking me to return that book back. So the ugly history regarding the fate of many segregation-era African-American cemeteries was highlighted in 2019 when two forgotten cemeteries in Tampa were rediscovered. Using ground-penetrating radar to discover nearly 200 graves, Tampa's Zion Cemetery was buried and forgotten under a public housing complex and warehouse prior to the Tampa Bay Times receiving a tip from a cemetery researcher. More research unveiled 5 additional erased African-American cemeteries throughout the Tampa Bay region. However, for those in Florida's historic African-American communities, this news was not surprising or unique. As horrible as the discovery in Tampa sounds, examples of abandoned, disgraced, desecrated, and disturbed cemeteries can be found all across the state. This includes an early 2020 incident in Jacksonville, where the forgotten Eastport Colored Cemetery was, quote, rediscovered when it was used as a filled dirt site for a nearby roadway construction project. The fate of Zion and Eastport cemeteries are just the tip of the iceberg, however. A burial ground task force mobilized by a legislator in 1998 reported that more than 40 to 50% of the state's cemeteries are neglected and abandoned. Across the state, there could be more than 3,000 unpreserved African-American cemeteries. Many of these cemeteries in Duval County specifically actually predate the 1822 founding of Jacksonville, as this region was once home to more than 100 plantations where enslaved Africans cultivated rice, indigo, cotton, and other crops along the St. Johns River. One example is the historic Salmon Cemetery in Arlington. Here lies the descendants of Anna Kingsley and Zephaniah Kingsley. Recently designated to the National Register of Historic Places, this cemetery is also believed to be the final resting place of Anna Kingsley, a West African who was enslaved and sold to Cuba. Anna eventually became the wife of Zephaniah Kingsley, a planner and enslaver herself as a free person of color in the early 19th century Florida. Her descendants were major contributors to a free Black community and society that resided in the Arlington area prior to the Civil War. A drive around present-day Jacksonville today will reveal the presence of many antebellum era cemeteries. These include the Arlington Community Cemetery in Arlington, Lofton Cemetery in Mandarin, and if we look harder, we'll also discover burial grounds negatively impacted by modern development, such as Amelia Allen's Franklintown Cemetery and La Villa's Brick Church Cemetery, which happens to be under a mid-20th century warehouse complex. However, those large oak trees on site are sure to have stories to share. Then there is Mount Hermon Cemetery. Mount Hermon was developed around 1880 to serve as the final resting place for Jacksonville's rapidly growing Black community during Reconstruction. In 1941, the cemetery was deeded to the city with the requirement that the property be used either as a public cemetery or park. By 1949, it was described in local newspapers as being an overgrown vacant lot with high weeds and headstones. In 1953, with the construction of Interstate 95, eliminating a nearby park for the African-American community, Mount Hermon Cemetery was eyed as a replacement park for that project. By 1970, Emmett Reed Park and Community Center had been developed on top of Jacksonville's first large African-American cemetery. Today, Emmett Reed Park and the Community Center retain visual reminders of this desecrated burial ground. This includes the headstone, a headstone in the middle of a public street, and the broken headstone of Letty King, a 22-year-old woman who passed and who was buried in Mount Hermon in 1905. However, despite the devastation, what remains is a vestige to the past and a link to this woman whose story today may otherwise be totally unknown and forgotten. Then there's the story of the Moncrief Road Cemeteries District, probably the largest concentration of African-American burial grounds in the state of Florida. The oldest cemetery in the district was established in 1909 by the Afro-American Life Insurance Company and A.L. Lewis, Florida's first Black millionaire and founder of Amelia Island's American Beach. This cemetery district includes Memorial, Sunset Memorial, Mount Olive, Greenwood, Restlawn, and Pinehurst cemeteries, and was specifically developed because African Americans not being allowed equal and inclusive access to public cemeteries in Jim Crow era Jacksonville. Not only a final resting place for African Americans who played a key role in the building of Jacksonville and Florida as a whole, these spaces were also used as recreational spaces for the surrounding community at a time when public parks were also not equitably placed in communities of color. An unintended consequence of desegregation, integration led to companies who once maintained these cultural landscapes eventually going bankrupt, leading to long time neglect and eventual abandonment. Nevertheless, these historic cemeteries are landscapes and history museums that are the final resting places of a who's who in Jacksonville. In Memorial Cemetery, for example, Mabel Irvin Latson Eberhardt was Florida's first African-American female dental hygienist. And then over in the Freedman Cemetery in Old City Cemetery in the east side of Jacksonville, that cemetery is the final resting place of Mother Coffey, an associate of Marcus Garvey, who was assassinated in Miami during the 1920s. Eartha White, a humanitarian, businesswoman, civil rights leader, and founder of La Villa's Clara White Mission. And Sally B. Mathis, one of the first women and one of the first African Americans elected to Jacksonville City Council in the 20th century. So as we continue our quest to discover and build upon what makes Jacksonville a special place, the story of our abandoned African-American cemeteries and the work being done to save them are critical to this effort. So I'm going to ask a question to Adrienne and Sarah now, but before I ask that question, I do want to remind everyone, if you have any questions or comments that you want us to answer during the next hour and a half, please use the chat box to drop that question in there and we will get to it. So ladies, this is for you, and who wants to go first? Doesn't matter. So looking back at your own past, I'm pretty interested in knowing how you got involved in the passion of saving cemeteries and African-American cemeteries specifically.
Well, I'll jump in there. How's that? My passion for cemeteries began very young. I have a wonderful letter from my grandmother to my mother, who must have been babysitting me, and she writes in there, "I love to see Sarah twirling in the cemetery," because to me, cemeteries were a part of the community, a place I felt very safe in, a place I could learn about distant history and also really recent. So I just went back to visit that cemetery this summer. And I was encouraged actually by meeting you, Ennis, and talking about your family, that I went for the first time this summer and visited most of my family cemeteries across the US. So it was pretty amazing, because I think I have a very academic interest in cemeteries and a very passionate community service passion for cemeteries, but it's really important to remember these are real places sacred to families and communities, and to participate and share that with our fellow TAFA-philes. I mentioned briefly in our introduction, when you get involved in moving cemeteries, it's a really personal endeavor, because you are a caretaker for these very important remains, and the archaeologists who do this work do it with a lot of passion and concern and a lot of respect, but it is damaging. It is something, it's like a violence to the remains to have them removed, no matter how carefully it's done. So seeing that 1, 10, dozens too many times in my former state, and moving here, and just seeing that in my community here in St. Augustine, it is an epidemic of the African American cemeteries and what has happened, and to realize it's scalar. It's a city, it's this county, it's a state, it's the Southeast, it's prevalent everywhere. And to talk about this topic of cemeteries, and to do it in foreign countries, and realize we have a very unique, specific issue here in Southeast United States, unlike many places in the rest of the world, and we really need to address it.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you, Ennis, for the shout out in your presentation. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't have known purchasing that book would have set you on such an incredible journey. So I'm glad to have played a small part in what has become something really big for you and your family. Yeah, for me, I'm similar to Sarah. I vividly remember the first cemetery I visited, or at least the first cemetery I remember visiting was when I was very young in Montgomery, Alabama. It's called Oakwood Cemetery. And I actually went back there several years ago and visited it again, kind of in honor of this journey it set for me that I would have had no idea knowing as a kid, right? But I was just something about the cemetery as a place of beauty and calm and quiet, but also kind of understanding at a young age that there were a lot of stories there because of it was people, right? So that really intrigued me. And being in Montgomery, Alabama, I was exposed to the civil rights era history as a kid, very young. And I ended up taking that interest and curiosity with me into college, where I majored in history with an emphasis on Southern African American history during the civil rights era. And after that, I went to law school thinking I was going to be a civil rights attorney. And I ended up not doing that. I went into land use and zoning. And I also got a master's degree in preservation. So I've kind of been able to still come full circle. Even though I'm a licensed attorney, I don't practice in civil rights. I've ended up doing a lot of policy work around African American history and land use and planning, and cemeteries are a big part of that. So I have experience working with cemetery master plans, which I'll touch upon in a minute. And yeah, it's just a passion for me. I like Sarah said, there's these aren't, just places on a map. They are sacred. They are spiritual. They are more than your average place in a community. So that's really important to me, to help protect these sites as a very sacred place. And with that, Ennis, do you want me to do my presentation?
Thank you. I was going to ask a question about that, but it's going to lead right into your presentation. So you are an expert in cultural and natural resource policy. And as you mentioned, your preservation specialties, include African American history and cemeteries. So yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the use of African American cemeteries or really the definition of them as cultural landscapes, and then what protection strategies for them may look like?
Yeah, great segue. I'd be happy to. Let's see. All right. All right. So yeah, I'm going to touch upon what Ennis mentioned and what I mentioned a little bit as well, looking at African American cemeteries as a specific and very unique type of historic resource. So I mentioned I work in historic preservation, and that really looks at the built environment, but cemeteries are a part of that. So even within preservation, there's a subset of what's called a cultural landscape. And cemeteries squarely fit into this category of what is a cultural landscape. And the definition generally is landscapes that have been affected, influenced, or shaped by human involvement. So looking around at our communities and our world, it's rare to find a landscape that hasn't been in some way affected, influenced, or shaped by human involvement at this point. So it's really quite broad and encompassing, but cemeteries are definitely one of these things. And there are these 4 types of cultural landscapes that are generally recognized: designed landscapes, ethnographic, historic sites, and vernacular landscapes. Vernacular being not formally planned necessarily, but just kind of evolved based on the use of people in the area. And cemeteries could fit into more than one of these categories. There are, for example, the rural cemetery movement of the late 19th century. Those are very elaborate designed landscapes. But some are more vernacular, if it was just happened to be next to a church, for example, or on someone's private property, it's a variety. And then of course, there also can be ethnographic and historic. So cemeteries kind of can fit into any or all of these categories. And cemeteries represent a variety of things. So Ennis mentioned they're kind of, these history museums. They represent a lot of things to a community and to our culture. They represent different customs related to specific groups of people. They obviously represent history, people associated with a community. Again, that idea of purposeful design, or it could have been very organic design. There's craftsmanship involved with the creation of different stones and monuments. So for example, that picture at the top is obviously a very elaborate mausoleum that involved a lot of very skilled craftsmanship to construct. But then the top right picture, you see what I would call a vernacular stone, which is it's a piece of concrete and someone carved in the information. It's still craftsmanship though. Someone had to know how to be able to do that. It's just a different type. And then lastly, like I touched upon, these being sacred spaces, cemeteries are reflective of spirituality and religion of a variety of different groups of people. The picture in the middle there is Bosque Bello Cemetery in Fernandina Beach, and that is the particular plot of many of the nuns from St. Joseph's. So that's a very specific example of a religious setting that you might find in a cemetery. But they really represent important cultural pieces of our communities. So some of the threats that are impacting cemeteries, and has touched upon some of the cemeteries in Jacksonville that have experienced some of these threats. Development is a big one. And at the top right there, you can see Palm Springs Cemetery here that is in Jacksonville, associated with the Cosmo community, a Gullah Geechee community. You can see how much development has completely surrounded that cemetery. And if you aren't familiar with where the turnoff is for that cemetery off Fort Caroline Road, you'd blink and you'd miss it. But the cemetery is still there. It's very well loved and maintained. It's actually on the National Register of Historic Places. And Sarah might touch upon that a little bit. But that's a huge threat to these cemeteries. Ennis shared some examples where cemeteries have been completely obliterated because development just went right on top of them. And that in particular is something that African-American cemeteries have faced throughout our culture here in the United States. Neglect and age, here on the bottom, you can kind of see some examples of cemeteries that have just been overgrown, or the monuments and memorials simply don't last, or they haven't received attention in a while. That's certainly a threat. And then here in Florida, climate change is an enormous threat. And that's something else I work on. And part of why I ended up coming to Miami, because I'm really interested in this intersection between climate change and historic resources. So this picture at the bottom here is just an example of how many cemeteries in Florida are at risk for a variety of things, but climate change and sea level rise flooding being a big one of those. And certainly you can see Northeast Florida has a big concentration of cemeteries at risk. So what are some strategies for protection of cemeteries? There's a variety of them. I won't go into detail on all of these, but feel free. I'll have my contact info at the end. I'm always delighted to talk at length about cemeteries. So if any of these are interesting, I'm happy to be a resource. But there are something, vulnerability assessments, kind of what it sounds like. You're determining the level of vulnerability of specific resources, for example, to sea level rise. Zoning and land use regulations and policies, extremely important, as are historic preservation regulations and ordinances, and cemetery ordinances can be specific to a cemetery. Cultural mapping, which is a practice that really involves, it's a little more anthropological. It involves a lot of work with communities, doing oral histories, understanding locations, places that were significant. The experience and individual engagement. So to the extent we can engage people around protecting cemeteries, that's huge. Having community involvement, continued use and attention. A watched and active cemetery is the most protected cemetery. So that's really important as well. It's a bigger issue if a cemetery can no longer be used for burials. It's extra important to have those eyes on the cemetery and people involved with it. And then lastly, documentation. So a couple of strategies for documentation, there's kind of traditional documentation for cemeteries, and then there's a little kind of more contemporary, which I'll talk about next. But traditional documentation in historic preservation in general kind of revolves around these things. The Historic American Building Survey, the Historic American Landscape Survey. You can see an example of a Howells survey, Historic American Landscape Survey picture here, where these are very specific criteria for how you document historic places using measured drawings, essentially. And then these are kept on file with the Library of Congress. So that's a very traditional way to do it, typically very time consuming, can be very costly. And then in Florida, we have a cultural resource inventory, which is called the Florida Master Site File. Hopefully Sarah's going to touch upon that a little bit, but it's basically a log of all of our historic and cultural resources in the state. And each site has literally a file, a document that is used to record the locations and some general information about the site. So that's kind of traditional forms of ways we can document cemeteries. But thanks to technology, there are a lot of really amazing ways that we can document cemeteries now using new things like photogrammetry, drones, geographic information service, mapping, GIS analysis, ground penetrating radar. And then kind of, these are more traditional, but still equally important. Again, that citizen input, hearing from people who have recollections or memories about places. And then this is very traditional actually, but just, boots on the ground surveying. So actual physical surveying of a cemetery and the monuments or locations. These are just a couple of examples, and I can put the links in the chat. And I understand that all links that are shared will also be sent out in an email after the presentation. So if you don't get them right now, don't worry. But this example on the top is from East End Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. They've done a really amazing thing with actually using drones and GIS analysis. It's a combination. that they combined to do this documentation of the cemetery. East End is a historically African-American cemetery. And they, because of the nature of the vegetation and the topography and many, many years where the cemetery was not cared for, there's a real question about where burials might be, how many there might be. And so they've been able to use this technology to make some really educated guesses. And that's what all those different dots represent. And then the Hart Island project is in New York. And that was kind of, it served as the potter's field, basically, for unclaimed people in New York. And there's been a real kind of advocacy for that area. And this interactive website encourages people to tell stories about people they may have known who ended up there, to document, locate the sites. So there's some really innovative ways to document cemeteries now, but also share that information with people. And then another strategy that I have experience working on with my background in policy is master plans for cemeteries. And these are really important. They establish cemeteries as a big part of local planning, so land use planning, and as a significant historic resource in a community. They establish policy and can resolve any potential conflicts between other existing policies in a community. And they can help lead to creating cemetery ordinances or strengthen existing ones. These plans can also address things like, if the cemetery is still active, it can address basic management strategies for an active cemetery. If it's not active, it can address more preservation and protection goals. But these are just some examples from different places around the country. But when I worked in Fernandina Beach, we developed, working with the community, a master plan for Bosque Bellows Cemetery, which was really important to have done, which is because of the historic significance of that still active cemetery. So that's another example of a strategy to help protect cemeteries. And then that's my contact info, but I'm happy to put it in the chat as well. I'll copy and paste it. And that's me at Cemetery Camp, which is an actual thing, sponsored by the Association for Gravestone Studies, which is a really neat organization. And that is me learning how to reset headstones and monuments in a cemetery, which is actually easier than you would think. But yeah, I'll copy and paste that info. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ennis, I believe.
Thank you, Adrienne. Let me make sure my face is showing up on the screen here. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's for me, that was like, just information overload. Like there's a lot of things as an urban planner and a historian I'm taking from that, and I want to apply it even, to my own journey and my own family history and seeing what I could dig up there. So thank you for sharing that. Sarah, before I ask a question that's going to lead your presentation, we do have tons of questions coming in, which is great. I'm going to throw two out here for both of you. And the first one is based off the experience you've seen over the course of your careers. How does the neglect and displacement of African-American burial grounds compare to that of other cemeteries? And then the second question, which kind of dovetails this, is does the owner of a private burial ground need to approve its application as a historic site?
Well, I'll tag in and Adrienne can clean up my statements after. So first was, yeah, I'm borrowing my own slide in just a minute, just to say the quote that we're all the same in death really bothers me, because you can go and visit cemeteries and understand that not all places, not all people are created equal, and there is a large amount, there is a large amount disproportionate of African-American cemeteries, and have some data we can post on that. And the other question was about private land. Any site can be listed to the Florida Master Site File. You do not need landowner permission, but when it goes to National Register nominations or historic plaques, markers, those places do need landowner permission. So I would encourage anyone, no matter what land type sites, historic cemeteries are on, that they be listed to the Florida Master Site File. You don't need anyone's permission. You can do that. We can help you do that. Get those listed because that's very important. And Adrienne, you want to tag in and clean that up?
No, you did a great job. That Sarah's exactly right. For the master site file, those are literally just a recording. So anyone can record a form and turn that in. But for state historic markers and National Register nominations, yeah, you have to have owner consent, sign off. And very likely also for local historic resource designation. That depends on jurisdiction, but very likely it requires owner consent too. I will say, as far as the difference in how cemeteries are treated, I think it could be a whole separate panel discussion just about institutionalized and systemic racism and how different cemeteries are treated. For example, I gave that I mentioned East End Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. For years, the state legislature of Virginia funded maintenance of Confederate cemeteries, but did nothing for African-American cemeteries. So I think it's, that's just like one example of how there's an absolute differential in how cemeteries are treated. And, a lot of the ownership issue of cemeteries is also very complicated potentially when it comes to African-American cemeteries. And that's also another discussion we can get into if we have time, but finding the owners or having an active owner sometimes is not as easy as you think it would be for a variety of reasons, but that also makes it a little challenging.
All right, thanks for that. So Sarah, I'm going to toss this over to you. I had a great time getting to know you and your colleagues at the Keeping History Above Water Conference in Charleston last year. And so I know what FPAN is, but I think some of our participants and attendees today may not know. So could you explain what is FPAN and what is FPAN, what type of work are you doing to preserve cemeteries in the region?
Yeah, and is it all right to pull up presentation, or did you want me to answer that before?
It's all yours.
Excellent, because I have a slide for that. Yeah, the Florida Public Archaeology Network is going into its 15th year, 16th year, and we're a statewide organization. We have a couple members on the call today that are listening in, and they are archaeologists across the state that are available to help you with historic cemetery issues as far as advice or go out and help record or just be a resource. So if you don't know who to call, don't call Ghostbusters. Call FPAN and we'll help you get to the right place. If we don't know the answer, we'll help you find someone who knows the answer. But thank you again for letting me speak for a few minutes. And I know we're at information overload at this wonderful panel, and it's probably best to hear us chatting and discussing rather than looking at the presentation. So I have a couple thoughts that are a little provocative to invite more discussion on the topic for the day. I do want to pay respect to elders of the past of our tribal nations in Florida, and also the Gullah Geechee Nation and descendants of those enslaved, and a large part of our topic for discussion today. Some of the questions I saw coming in are like, what can we do? What can we do to make sure these sites are relatively safe for another 100 years? And that's a lot of the focus of the work that we do. I have a lot of issue with the word abandon, unless we're going to talk about reckless abandon of unrestrained and uninhibited passion for cemeteries, then yes, applies. But having been deserted or cast off, as you've alluded to, and also other people in the chat, a lot of it is lack of access, lack of awareness, other things that come into play as far as private and public ownership, how things got forgotten. And that word abandoned just shows up on a lot of the literature. So we need to have some, maybe we can come up with a corrective term today. And I mentioned this before, no matter how big your house is, our graves will always be the same size. No, it's absolutely. It's offensive to think that's true, and certainly applies to the African American burials that we see. Is we see the evidence of systemic racism just very blatantly in front of our eyes when you can look across a fence line and see two properties managed completely different. And I like to say it's not a 5-year problem, it's not a 100-year, it's not a 200-year-old problem. This is hundreds of years. And going back to the first slide and paying respect to elders of the past, this panel today is talking about 200 years of history in Jacksonville, but of course there are prehistoric burials and remains in the Jacksonville area going back thousands of years. About every 10 years, it seems, we get really interested in doing something about cemeteries as a state, and I was there for the Blue Ribbon Commission final meeting where they presented their report, and I included that in the links so you can go through and look and see what was the state of what we knew already in 2007, what has been done, what hasn't been done, because it's pretty shocking to go back into some of those documents and know, oh, we knew there was a problem for quite a while, and just trying to keep getting that needle moving along. At FPAN, our 3 main goals are to provide education and outreach, assist local governments, and assist the state. So one of our flagship programs is a cemetery resource protection training workshop where we do we do classroom work with volunteers, with those interested in being stewards of cemeteries, and then go out and do some hands-on work. And we've had one scheduled at Cosmo that keeps, it's a migrating workshop, but we're hoping it will happen this fall. A pandemic didn't help, that's for sure. But the gist of that workshop is to look at micro problems such as the lichens, what's happening to the headstones, how to keep these headstones in place and from tipping over or being decayed or being vandaled. And then the macro problems like Adrienne was talking about with sea level rise and climate change, or are certain populations of cemeteries targeted at different times. So really zooming way out to get a statewide picture. And this is, if you wanted to see what 1,200 cemeteries look like on a map, there you go. And there should be about 8,000 dots. So this is a fraction of the dots that should be on this map, and those data gaps are another big problem. So what can you do? The Florida Historic Cemetery Inventory is a program going on right now, sponsored by Division of Historical Resources and FPAN. The link is in the blog post I put in the chat, and you can fill out. If you have not received, you can get a postcard and fill out information and send it into the state. And the idea is asking citizens for help to let us know about cemeteries in their area that may not be recorded, so we can get at those data gaps, because we can't manage or we can't preserve what we don't know it's there. Doing cemetery recording, Robbie Boggs was rained out today, but she is out in Pinehurst Cemetery doing some recording, and she has done this with volunteers continuously over the last few years. So getting out there, as Adrienne said, does make the cemetery safer, and getting a good picture of the primary resources that are on that landscape and recorded has been very useful over time for a lot of different reasons: vandalism, storms, how things start to migrate and move around, and documentation of where things came from. So our crypt workshops have been really successful. Maybe if you've been to one, put it in the chat where you went to a crypt workshop. We've done just about 100 across the state, and we have annual conferences so that those who graduate from the program can get into more intense topics. It's just really, we miss getting out there a lot with our volunteers. We do more with cemeteries than those efforts. We do a lot of monitoring, going back and repeat visits to cemeteries. We can do some 3D scanning, preservation through recordation. Those Florida Master Site File updates, just as important as visiting a site, are doing the updates and making sure it's up to snuff, and sharing out our reports with the community. The partnerships that we get involved with, I don't want to discuss too much, but it is a large time and emotional investment because this work is very important and it can't be done quickly. So we've been working with Representative Jenkins, who is on the call today, with the Gullah Geechee Nation. We have aligned our priorities for cemetery preservation to the nation for what are their priorities when it comes to their burial sites. How can we help? Have frequent meetings, and then it takes a lot of reconciliation of different forms of documents, what we've seen, and how to update that to get the best documentation we can of what we see in the field. So this is closer into the Jacksonville area. And just to say, a lot of the cemeteries that we think we know about are either in the wrong place or yet to be identified. And there's a ticking clock on some of them with sea level rise, erosion, and development. So the more we can get the dots on the map, because that's what it is looked at and tested before development occurs. And just to make sure you're aware of the very recent events, current events section of my report, there's a lot going on with advocacy, the task force on abandoned African American cemeteries, their final report. There's a QR code, but the link is in that post I gave you, and it's a very good, thorough read through. Some really great experts came together and looked at all the different angles that they could in the short amount of time and focused in on the issues of identification, protection, maintenance, education, memorialization. So a lot of that is addressed in their report, and they filed it so quickly, they moved so quickly because they wanted to get the cemetery bill, and this is active now, and I put a link to that so you can keep up with it, and hopefully it will be signed tomorrow. Things can be through the legislature, but a lot of things got amended as far as providing easements and getting that accessibility piece easier. So I have to go back and see what last amendments were filed. And there's a federal bill, so you can support that federal bill on the national level to get some funding for the African American Burial Ground Preservation Program. I put a link to our article on cemeteries as participatory museums if you want to learn more about our crypt program. And lastly, as Adrienne mentioned, there's a guide to filling out the cemetery form. We are lucky in Florida to have a separate cemetery form to record as a cultural resource. The guide is about 40 pages long. It's only a one page form to fill out for a historic cemetery, or just a postcard in some cases, but all you want to know about cemeteries and recording them in Florida can be found in that guide as well, and you have the link in the chat. Great, well, thank you.
All right, well, thank you. That's a ton of information as well, very critical information. Just reading through the comments, there's several people who want links and information on the maps and some of the information shown there. So everything is being recorded, and we will be sending up, I believe, a follow-up email with what we're sharing here today, so everyone will have access to what has been shown. Oh, Sarah, were you saying something? You were on mute.
No, my colleague is showing up as a different name in the chat, so I want to provide the map, but it's interesting.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. So what I want to do now, we got about 30 minutes, really more than 30 minutes, 40 minutes. I just want to jump into really just dialogue between the three of us on answering many of the questions in the chat and in the Q&A box, as well as any questions and things that we may pop up in our heads. So to get things started, I want to go back to the Q&A box. This question is in regards to Mount Olive Cemetery in Jacksonville, but I can say it's something that really applies to all African-American cemeteries, historic cemeteries. And it is, what are your recommendations for African-Americans who desire to find their ancestors' headstones in Mount Olive Cemetery, or specifically, what is needed to find an actual burial lot in place?
So I'm not familiar with Mount Olive's level of surveying, but when I talked about documentation of cemeteries, that's a big part of why it's so important, is because you can go stone by stone and have a log and recording of who's buried where. Especially for older cemeteries, black, white, any, it doesn't matter who, older cemeteries just often don't have records anymore. You know, they've been lost to time or whatever. So that's where that on the ground surveying becomes really important, because then you can create a database of known memorials. So lots of places do that. Lots of cemeteries have that. For example, up in Nassau County, the Amelia Island Genealogical Society has done that for most of the many of the cemeteries in Nassau County, and it's on their website. You can find it. The challenge with African-American cemeteries is just like in historic preservation in general, African-American cultural resources were not prioritized historically for surveying projects for any kind of attention whatsoever, frankly. So a lot of the cemeteries either have never been recorded or surveyed to that level of detail, or African-American cemeteries, because oftentimes they weren't given the same level of attention, especially after desegregation. The maintenance has become challenging. So it's either hard to read the markers are missing, they're broken, or in many cases, people may have not had stone memorials at all. They might have used materials like wood or even just rocks or plants that we don't now have a way of knowing that someone's necessarily buried there. That's why those projects that are doing guesses on, you know, where people are buried helps at least identify the number of people that might be there, but it can be tricky. So if it's a survey, if it's a cemetery that's had that level of detail recorded already, then you might be able to find out. Otherwise, it's a bit of a guessing game at this point. I don't know if Sarah, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, just, you know, physically visiting places can provide some opportunity to at least try and start to get an answer. Looking at census, at documents, oral histories among family members. It can be very hard to do what we called ground truth. You know, you might hear where things are, but to find them located in the ground. But that doesn't mean that the effort is a loss. You know, you should do that. You should try and figure it out, like a mystery that may take a long time and may not provide ultimately satisfying answers, but you're going to find more information. I'm going to put in the chat Robbie, who's over here on my right, and I keep yelling at, but she did a cemetery recording project at Nombre de Dios, and that can give you an idea of how long it might take to do like a 10-meter sections of a cemetery to do that recording. But then you have a lot of data, like somebody mentioned in the chat, of genealogy societies that go through at least trying to make searchable databases, and that Black Cemetery Society that I put in the chat and the links as well. You know, I think those networks will be very important in trying to share information and other success stories of what have worked for other people to try and find.
Yeah, Sarah's point about looking at documents and doing sort of more of a genealogical type exploration, that can often lead to finding information, you know, for example, on death certificates or other things. There might be that information available, obituaries, that kind of thing. Find a Grave is a public website that, you know, people are volunteers and go out and do a lot of cemetery documentation. So that's another place to look.
And Billions of Graves, that's another website. And they are really great, especially for giving access to descendants and sharing information. But it's just that caution of a data gap, because if they're not on the site file, the state statutes don't say that developers need to check Billions of Graves or Find a Grave. They have to check the Florida Master Site file. So do make sure that your cemeteries are listed in the official inventory.
All right, and I know, just, you know, personally speaking, I mean, I've been tracing my family back to early in the 19th century now. It's gotten to a point to where some I'm just never going to know. You know, through all the resources that have been mentioned here, I've been able to identify sites identify rural sites in the middle of nowhere, South Carolina. I've been able to visit those sites. And, you know, not everybody's going to have a headstone these days. But with that being said, using those 19th century, 1870 census records, for example, I have been able to at least, so I would say, identify sites based off of looking at additional family members and neighbors within those census records, and identifying what churches they went to. Every now and then you get a death certificate or something like that, and they've been able to help me hone in personally on exact locations where various ancestors who were enslaved are likely, they're buried. I do want to answer something real quick here. This is on Mount Hermon.
I was going to jump in and add, because it's my
Go ahead. Feel free.
But, really excellent point about the churches and other structures and parts of the community, because I've learned from looking at Adrienne's stats about just how underrepresented the African-American community is writ large in Florida. And we need to do so much better at getting these places listed that can lead to more opportunities for finding out more about cemeteries. But Adrienne, what would you say, it's hard to do off the top of your head, but what some of the deficit percentages are in looking at the National Register or Florida Master Site File listings for Florida?
Yeah, so Sarah's referencing some work I've done related to equity and historic preservation. So for example, of all the historic sites listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is a federal honorary listing, only 8% of those sites deal with racial or ethnic minorities or women. So most of our sites, at the federal level that are recognized historically are telling the story of white men and their legacy in the country. And I did a similar data analysis for our Florida Master Site File documents and the sites in Florida listed on the National Register, and the trends track there as well. So, but it's even less. I think in Florida, it's like 1 or 2% of our documented sites on the Florida Master Site File deal with African-American history. And, we keep emphasizing that. If you take away anything, understand how important it is to get cemeteries on the Florida Master Site File, because that is also the place that like transportation projects, for example, anything using federal money, they have to, by federal law, take into account effects on cultural resources. And the only place they look is the Florida Master Site File. Some surveys may, if they have more time and money and budget, go into more detail looking at other records, but the Master Site File is the #1 place people go when they're evaluating development impacts. And so if we don't have them listed, people aren't going to find them. And that's a really big deal. So documentation on the site file is really critical. And there's so much in Florida we don't know. Oh yeah, there it is. Thanks, Sarah. So those are my stats that I did for another presentation I do around equity and historic preservation, but you can see there of the National Register sites in Florida. And this is data from fall 2020, so it's changed maybe slightly, but 4% of our National Register sites in Florida are dealing with African-American or Black heritage, and only 1.4% of our master site files do. So, and you can see some of the other categories as well that I looked at, but we're not doing great to date on documentation of these places. So, and those, I should clarify, that's not just cemeteries. That's looking at all historic or cultural resource locations, buildings, etc.
So I want to answer a real quick question about Mount Hermon Cemetery in Jacksonville, which is one of the places I've featured in my presentation. The question was, were there any individuals interned in Mount Hermon Cemetery and moved elsewhere prior to the community center being built over it? That's the first question. And then the second question, which is right under that, is the Thompson-Williams grave is in such a strange position. Is anything known about the decision to put the sidewalk in the exact spot of his grave? Is there any indication that Mount Hermon Cemetery will be restored and protected? So going back to were individuals removed to other places? Possibly. I mean, there's articles, old articles out there about the conversion of this cemetery into a park, but part of this is who was telling that narrative in some of those 1950 articles, and another part of that is there are presently burial sites within the cemetery, so it's not unimaginable to believe that there are likely several individuals who were likely not removed. Their headstones may have been removed. And over the course of time, various headstones, such as that Letty King headstone, has turned up in the park. And people within the community tend to put those headstones in one of the last family plots that on that property. In regards to the Thompson-Williams grave, there's a story behind that as well. That grave, that headstone itself, the story is Thompson-Williams gave his life to save a white woman in 1908, and civic leaders in the city paid for that headstone. Family members actually don't agree with that story. They believe something more sinister led to his death, and that was a way to kind of change the narrative of that. However, when this area was redeveloped, city leaders at that point in time, and again, this is in the middle of the 1950s, so you're talking about a civil rights era, you're talking about an era when Jacksonville named schools after Confederate generals in spite of what was taking place in terms of the fight for integration. So the design of that headstone being in the middle of the street and in the sidewalk is almost similar to a Confederate monument in general for the African American community, and how that was placed in the redevelopment of that area. And then I guess last question there is there any indication that Mount Hermon Cemetery will be restored and protected? I haven't heard anything about it being restored. I mean, it is a park today. It's got buildings on, community center sitting on top of it. However, through events like this, one of the things I like to do is at least expose the history, and in a way to, they say, what is this? Squeaky wheel gets the grease, it gets the oil, or something like that. But the more we can talk about these spaces that have been, desecrated, perhaps there is a way to build momentum and support to better protect, or at least, share their story. And I know I've seen some cemeteries across the state that have been desecrated with buildings built over them or development sites, but there's still been a movement to go back and at least memorialize and pay homage to those who are there. And I'm just going to keep going unless you two have something else you want to jump in, or some go to the next question. All right, so I'm going to jump in the chat box quick here. I don't personally have any updates on the Ocean Way Cemetery discovery, but the Ocean Way Cemetery discovery, for those of you who may not know what Ocean Way is, I believe this is reference to the Eastport Colored Cemetery, which was essentially an area that was owned by the Broward family prior to the Civil War. There's a paper mill in the area. I think it was St. Regis was the paper mill company, and the labor force, the African-American labor force at that time, developed a small community called Pollywood, and there was a church in the middle of Pollywood. And churches tend to be the social center, the community center, really just everything for African-American communities, especially during the late 19th century, early 20th century, and before desegregation. And so that church had a burial ground. And over time, that land fell in ownership of a paper company. I know Nassau County has a lot of sites like this. We talk about turpentine and lumber and things like that. But for a number of years, that area was a place that a paper company owned. People didn't have access to the area. And eventually, I guess the state purchased or made a deal to use some of the property there for fill dirt on a construction project. And that's when it was rediscovered that there was a cemetery there. But I haven't heard anything since that time. But maybe Sarah, Adrienne, maybe you know a little more than I do about that. But that is something I will definitely follow up with, because that was on my to-do list of things I want to do anyway, because it's been, I guess it's been 2 years now since that discovery. But yeah, I hadn't heard, much about what's taken place since, other than the state not using additional fill dirt from that location. I'm going to move on to the next question. Let's see. All right, this is in reference to a cemetery in Jacksonville Beach. And I guess along Penman Road, I know Sarah and Adrienne, you may not be familiar with Penman Road, but I'll read this anyways, and we'll see what we can do with this. All right, so along Penman Road South, they have started burying Caucasians in empty lots within the cemetery, justifying this cemetery gentrification because the city is paying for maintenance. Can anything be done to halt this practice? So I assume that, let's see, make sure I haven't missed anything here. All right, let me repeat that. It's two different posts here. So the city of Jacksonville Beach is taking over the maintenance of Lee Kirkland Cemetery along Penman Road in Jacksonville Beach. And I guess Lee Kirkland is actually a historic African-American cemetery. And I guess the city is now burying Caucasians within the empty lots of the cemetery. And so the quote is asking if, saying justifying this cemetery gentrification because the city is paying for maintenance. Can anything be done to halt this practice? I'll turn it over to you two on that one in terms of cemetery gentrification.
Yeah, I believe that's a legitimate concern, and one of the base issues is how do you pay for sustained cemetery care? Is one part of the issue is if there are not funds that are built in for care and maintenance or perpetual care, the money needs to come from somewhere. And that's one thing we get asked in our workshops too is, well, can we reopen them for more burials as a way to make money, which is even 1 degree away from the gentrification question, but it just seems like so many of these cemeteries are full. And I love that Jacksonville for a while had an idea of having a tax that the funds would go to cemetery care, but I don't think it went through. But it's like two problems, and maybe trying to help solve that underlying how to get funds for protection and preservation could also help alleviate that, looking to get more income for more burial plots. Especially as sea level rise and as the neighborhoods move around, we do see that as an issue, but it'll be interesting to hear what Adrienne responds.
So I will just say off the top of my head, legally, I don't think there's anything you could do to prevent that. That's not a question I've had asked before. It's a really interesting question. I haven't heard of that scenario before, so that's something I'll have to think about. But I don't think legally there would be a way prevent it in terms of saying, for example, only African-American people can be buried here. I think constitutionally, maybe that might bring up some issues, but I have to think about it. But I do think this is one of the maybe approaching it from the perspective that it's kind of risky. So I mentioned, with African-American cemeteries in particular, and often just older cemeteries, we don't know exactly where people are buried because their markers may be gone, or they were moved, or they're in the wrong place, or they never had one. And so to put active burials in a historic cemetery, you don't know what you're disturbing. So to me, that might be an argument to the city is, how do they know they're not disturbing anything? That would be my take on it. How do they know that those are open plot areas that weren't ever used? But yeah, I think that's one way to go about it. Legally, though, I'm not sure. I would have to think more about that.
All right, so here's a Civil War era question for all of us. Have any Civil War era burial grounds been found? And I'm going to just say Northeast Florida, because I know all three of us have worked in Northeast Florida. So have any Civil War era burial grounds been found? And the comment is, there were many wounded soldiers brought from the Lusty battle to St. Augustine and Jacksonville. I guess I'm going to jump in first on that one. Yes, this whole region is filled with the number of burial grounds that predate the Civil War, and all across this region, you will find headstones of Civil War veterans, USCT troops. I wouldn't say there's any one specific burial ground where and more so than the other ones, because many of those who were involved in the Civil War were actually enslaved in this area. And once they were emancipated and during Reconstruction built a new life for themselves and their new communities and their families, they spread across this region. And so many of the burial grounds that were present at that time, they do have veterans who not only fought in the Battle of Lusty, but also occupied Fernandina, the Jacksonville area, and several other areas along the St. Johns River and Atlantic coast here.
Yeah, I would echo that. I'm not familiar with like a specific burial ground related to the Battle of Lusty, for example. There might be, I just don't know. But yeah, it's very common to find stones of Civil War veterans in all the cemeteries in the area, because many of our cemeteries date to the 19th century. So in both the white and the black sections of cemeteries, you'll see the federal style headstones for Civil War veterans.
All right, I'm going to jump back to the Q&A box and pick up the last two questions here. The first question is, are there any provisions within the recently adopted infrastructure bill which allocates capital specifically for this topic of African-American cemeteries? I would say I'm not aware of any within the infrastructure bill, but maybe you two know something about it.
I would say in general that CRM firms, cultural resource management firms, are looking to get a lot more business and work as the infrastructure bill goes on. So I would only guess that will lead to more cemeteries being documented through the federal 106 process and through the other ways that funds get distributed. But I don't think anything's specified that I'm aware of that would uniquely target African-American cemeteries.
And then here's another question. I know you two will know this one. So, are there any success stories of master plans and other land use methods being used on burial sites on private property?
Not that I'm aware of. Not to say you couldn't do master planning for private property. It's a great idea, you would just have to work with the private property owners. The ones I'm familiar with are typically for municipal cemeteries or publicly owned cemeteries, but I'm sure it's common, I'm sure modern day contemporary privately owned cemeteries have some kind of plans that they follow. But yeah, it's a great question. As far as historically owned or historic privately owned property, I'm not aware of any. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's a great question. But I would think it would be just as beneficial. I mean, planning would be just as important.
I have some crazy wild feelings about this question because it's such an area of potential and underused potential. I mean, there are cemetery sites everywhere that don't have anything related to those communities. The Water Management District has a lot of cemeteries on its property, and they are stewards of those cemeteries, and I think do a pretty good job. There are military sites, posts, bases. My dad is a airport manager, and he had cemeteries on the airport land he managed. So I know of a couple airports in Florida that have cemeteries. So I think we need to look for those success stories in the middle ground, because certainly there are federal and state stewards of cemeteries that aren't related to the main purpose of the land use today. And there are some enterprising businesses, but it gets very tricky fast. We know of an airport, not in Jacksonville, but it has a cemetery we can't even figure out because it was deeded in perpetuity to the community, and now it's part of this large private airport. So how did that happen? And communities don't have the war chest of funds it's going to take to figure out. And I don't think the airport director is going to be as good a steward for that cemetery as the descendants who have the rights to be there. So I think there's a lot of hope for corporate stewardship, and I would love that to be the next charge of the next few decades of like, wow, these groups really came together when they were not forced to. But I'm skeptical, especially when the land use and the preservation are so at odds. And then this question in our current law structure where it's the descendants that have the right to upkeep and maintain. Well, how do they do that? How do they get access to it? And then no obligations then on the landowner. They can't destroy it, but they aren't forced to maintain it. And that's at odds with a sound cemetery management plan. So you solve it, Ennis. You solve it, and we'll help in the ways that we can.
All right.
But I do think education and training, at any opportunity, and if they're airport manager, if they're a firefighter, if they're a teacher, like anyone who can get some education on cemeteries is great, and hopefully that bill will help provide more opportunities with a dedicated position at the state.
All right, we'll move on to the next question. What is the current status of work on enslaved burials on the Kingsley plantation?
If you look up the newspaper clippings, they had been relocated, and the National Park Service had quite a scalar communication plan of talking to descendants, and then talking to the wider community and academics, and then to the broader community when they made the announcements. The burials, as I understand, could be studied in place for some information, but that location is preserved and protected, and those burials are still there. So they're not awaiting analysis somewhere else, any information from. And the main reason to get information at that point is to figure out the boundaries, like how far an area do we need to protect, what is the cultural affiliation, who do we need to contact, and with those base answers, they communicated as they could what the findings were, but that, as far as I know, is suspended. I haven't heard any more new information.
All right. And let me get back on track here. I was scanning through the chat to see what questions I may have missed. Let's see. Okay, here's one. In terms of working with cemeteries, are youth or children formally involved in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, you could see in one of the photos, we had a 4-H club that got very active with preserving part of San Sebastian Cemetery. And that's very powerful when the youth can get involved and even lead some of the charges for stewardship. I've always wanted to do a cemetery camp because we have so many activities and things to discuss that if we could get the parents to sign them up for like a week, and we've pitched this idea a few times because there's just so much information, from storytelling to doing seriation to doing iconography to doing mapping, looking at the trees, coming up with their own master plans. That would be great. Adrienne and I once did an activity. We had Box City and the structures that the kids built and had to get permits for. And then we had the shoebox digs and talked about excavations of their neighborhoods. But if there'd be some way to add a cemetery into the mix, that would be great. I think we need unique and novel ways to engage K through 12 and beyond in how to care for cemeteries. I think they'd be deeply interested, as I was twirling in cemeteries. You can find me there later.
There's a really cool project that was done, I believe, Sarah, you might know, I think the Tampa folks for FPAN may have been involved to some degree, but I believe it was through the University of South Florida. And they've done a lot of work with high school students in a historically African-American cemetery. And have a curriculum developed for teachers around the cemetery. And I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head to put a chat, but I do know that has been a really neat project that's been going on over in the Tampa area.
If Nigel is still on the Zoom, maybe he can enter into the chat some information. And I know there was some education the funding was ceased. We got a note this past week, so that was pretty alarming. I can look up that and put that in the chat.
All right, well, unfortunately, quickly running out of time here, so I'm going to try to get through one more question. And this one is, do you have examples of Florida communities that have adopted a cemetery ordinance?
Yeah, so it's pretty common for local municipalities who own a cemetery, and public cemeteries are fairly common, that community probably has some kind of ordinance, but it's more likely relating to the management of the cemetery. So it probably involves like rules around, hours of operation and burial prices and things like that. As far as an ordinance about historic cemeteries and specifically regulating the historic part of a cemetery, I'm not as familiar with it. Some cemeteries might be included in a historic district, a local historic district, for example, so it might be subject to some kind of review for construction in the cemetery, for example. I am familiar with places, and again, I don't know them off the top of my head, but I have found there are some places in Georgia, I know, for example, that have more like historic cemetery advisory groups, and they have some level of role and local government, process for the work that gets done around the cemeteries. So yeah, there are all sorts of examples of cemetery ordinances. They're typically, again, more for the active cemeteries. But again, I would actually be really interested in researching that. So if you want to reach out to me, feel free, and I'm happy to do some homework.
All right.
Yeah, and I put in the chat the article on the House negating the education program for erased Black cemeteries, and above that, a link to the Hillsborough curriculum.
Oh, great. Yeah, you found it. Thank you. And I also just wanted to mention, I saw someone in the chat had included a link to Dr. Brittany Brown's dissertation. And I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Brittany Brown and her work. Her dissertation was on African American cemeteries in Jacksonville, and she's currently a professor outside of the state, but she's done a lot of really interesting work around that. So I want to check out her dissertation if you get a chance.
And I'll say ditto to that. So it is, well, it's just about 1:30 now, and I would love to keep talking all day, but I know we have to go back to work. So I just want, in closing, I do want to say that this event is the first of 6 in the 2 Centuries of Jacksonville series this year, which is co-produced between myself and the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund. Our second virtual event will be in April, and we'd love to have you join us. So stay tuned to more details by following the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, as well as the Jaxson Mag on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And in closing, I want to thank my 2 great panelists today, and all the guests for taking this hour and a half of the day to spend with us. So with that said, thank you and have a blessed day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.